Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, March 1st, 2026. Now, this is a situation where the best laid plans can go awry because of momentous geopolitical developments. Unfortunately, not happy geopolitical developments from our point of view. So on February 28th, 2026, early in the morning in Iran, a combination of major Israeli and United States strikes on that country was initiated, and thus far the damage has been immense. The supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, who had ruled that country for about 36 years, was one of the casualties. He was assassinated, and he was an 86-year-old man. So it's not like he was somebody in his prime who was actively attacking the United States or attacking Israel. And I will point out, too, this was an attack that was initiated by the governments of the United States and Israel. And I will really say the Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu administrations. And this is a matter that we have to contend with, being in the United States, being in a country that has initiated essentially what the US government itself and the Israeli government call a preemptive strike, what I would call a war of aggression, because the US was not attacked and Israel was not attacked in that particular instance. Both the United States and Israel have had a history of tensions with Iran since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, which led to the formation of the so-called Islamic Republic of Iran, really a theocracy, and a theocracy that did indeed oppress its own people. So there have been movements inside Iran which have flared up into mass protests every several years. The last time this happened was in January of this year, 2026. And the protests every time were brutally put down by that regime. And there are many Iranians who have been clamoring for freedom from that regime. When the Trump administration announced the strikes, Donald Trump also made a call for the Iranian people to overthrow their own regimes. There's a problem here, of course. It's difficult to go out into the streets and overthrow a regime when your cities are being bombed, when your places of residence are being endangered or destroyed. And it's difficult also to overthrow one's own regime when another power, an external entity, decides to invade one's country or bomb one's country and poses a more direct and immediate threat to one's life and the lives of one's families. And that's where it seems to me the decision to attack Iran in hopes that the Iranian people will then finish the job of overthrowing the regime was short-sighted and fails to understand the psychology of humans when faced with that extremely difficult situation, an oppressive regime on one hand, and an outright hot war, a foreign invasion on the other. So this is a troubling situation. It's a messy situation. there was already a brief war with Iran that you may remember. It happened in June of 2025, the so-called 12-day war, where the United States and Israel disabled, or at least thought they had disabled, key nuclear weapons development facilities in Iran, particularly the Fordo facility. The Iranian government then stated that it had essentially evacuated a lot of its personnel and infrastructure from that facility before it was bombed. It's not clear how much damage was actually done. It's clear that there was a remaining concern about Iran pursuing nuclear weapons. But also, our regular viewers of our virtual Enlightenment salons may recall that we held a special salon on June 22nd, 2025, entitled The Catastrophe of Escalation in the War with Iran. And essentially, the scenario that I expressed great concern about in that salon is the scenario that's unfolding today with a delay. And shortly after that salon, the 12-day war concluded, and I think a lot of us, myself included, breathed a sigh of relief because we thought, well, there was this attack, the strike on the nuclear weapons development facilities that purportedly did some damage, but then the Iranian regime decided to back down, decided to only retaliate in a kind of pro forma manner. So it seemed like the tensions had settled down. But one of the comments that I made in that salon was that it would be the greatest mistake to try to eliminate Ali Khamenei directly and to try to use lethal force against the leadership of Iran's regime, because one, that would corner them. That would mean that they would be desperate to fight for their lives. They would see no other way out. And two, this would send a very strong message to another authoritarian ruler, a very different authoritarian ruler, and the only one that is capable right now of a full-fledged nuclear war with the United States, Vladimir Putin. Because Putin has for a long time complained about the tendency of Western powers to overthrow governments, including authoritarian regimes with which he felt a certain kinship. Putin was talking about how unjust it was in his view that the US had engineered the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, and then later on, of course, the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. And for Hussein and Gaddafi, this did not end well at all. They lost their lives as a result of this. With Yanukovych, Putin rescued him. Putin allowed him to essentially have shelter, very nice shelter, in the vicinity of Moscow. But Putin's greatest fear, and what could back him into a corner, would be himself being threatened and endangered, and not just at risk of losing his power, but at risk of losing his life. And what concerns me, as I had expressed in the June 22nd, 2025 salon, is that the quite blatant and unconcealed killing of Khamenei sends exactly the wrong message to Putin, exactly the message that will radicalize him and embolden him and put him in a corner. But also, of course, from the standpoint of a US citizen, from the standpoint of somebody who has not just pledged allegiance to the flag, but explicitly pledged loyalty to the US Constitution when I became a US citizen. I am troubled by the blatant violation of the US Constitution that this attack constituted. Because nowhere in the US Constitution does it give the President of the United States unilateral authority to wage war against a country, to initiate military strikes. And of course, the US had not formally followed the mechanisms of the Constitution whereby Congress needs to declare war since the Korean War, which lasted between 1950 and 1953. But in subsequent undeclared wars, but very real de facto wars, such as the war in Vietnam, or the war in the Persian Gulf, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, or the attack on Afghanistan, the occupation of Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021, there was at least a pretense, some congressional authorization for the president to use force. And it could be a very broad, open-ended authorization, like the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. But there was authorization sought and given. And this, of course, is a precedent that was broken earlier this year by Donald Trump in the extrajudicial extradition of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. Again, not a pleasant character, not a character with whom I sympathize or whose regime I support or endorse in any manner. But what happened with Maduro was there was essentially a special military operation, a targeted military operation that extracted him from his presidential palace and sent him to New York to stand trial for the crimes of which he is accused. But even that, though no congressional authorization was given, it was portrayed as a police action. It was portrayed as enforcing essentially a warrant for his arrest, for him to stand trial. There was no such rationale. There was not even a fig leaf of cover for the blatant killing of Khamenei. And there's a world of difference between extraditing someone to stand trial, even a foreign leader, and just killing that person outright with no warning and no present crimes of which that person was being accused. Even though Khamenei did, of course, commit crimes against his own people, that was not the reason why he was killed in this instance. So this is a troubling situation all around, but we are today going to discuss some of the implications of that situation for transhumanism, for the transhumanist future that we in the US Transhumanist Party advocate and hope to reach, as well as for the world at large, and what this portends for peace, stability, or lack thereof in our epoch. So joining me today in the live stream is our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, as well as our member from Texas who heads the Texas Transhumanist Party, Alan Crowley. And we are going to have a discussion about 7 important questions today. We're going to welcome input from our audience as well via the YouTube chat, and hopefully we can make some headway in answering those questions. But I think this is a pivotal time in history, and this is the most consequential war and the most destructive war that I can recall in my lifetime since at least the Second Persian Gulf War, where the United States attacked and occupied Iraq. But of course, this war is just starting. We don't know what the eventual toll will be, but we can look at the toll thus far. In addition to the killing of Khamenei, there's a nice visual on Wikipedia. So there's a Wikipedia entry about the US strikes on Iran. And we can see, first of all, there are already US casualties, 5 seriously injured, 3 service members killed. In Israel, there are casualties of a greater extent because when the US strikes occurred, Iran and its regime lashed out pretty much indiscriminately at a bunch of Middle Eastern countries, including Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and of course Israel, because the regime of Netanyahu was the one that orchestrated the strikes that killed Khamenei. So 450 civilians were injured, 12 were killed, 11 were missing. And then we had in the Iranian side a huge, huge number of casualties. More than 1,000 targets were attacked. 48 officials within the Iranian government were killed, and 9 Iranian warships were sunk. Also, unfortunately, there have been major civilian casualties already. At least 201 people were killed, and there was a strike on a girls' school, the Minab school, where essentially over 100 young girls were killed. And I don't think anybody can make a case that those young girls were somehow complicit in the regime of Khamenei. So, while some people might say, well, Khamenei had it coming, he committed certain atrocities, these girls were blameless, and 747 civilians were injured. Then, in these other Arab countries that were attacked in retaliatory strikes by the Iranian regime, 3 people were killed, 58 others injured in the United Arab Emirates. 1 person was killed, 32 others injured in Kuwait, 16 people injured in Qatar, 5 people injured in Jordan, 4 people injured in Bahrain. And I will add also Dubai, which is a center of global commerce, technology, architecture, tourism, has been bombed as well. And there have been just some of these amazing skyscraper hotels that have been damaged. A lot of commerce through that part of the world has been disrupted. The oil market is in turmoil because a lot of oil did come from Iran. And now, of course, even shipments of goods through that part of the world, through the Strait of Hormuz, through the Persian Gulf, are pretty much blocked. Airline travel is in disarray as well. So a lot of economic disruption has already happened and more is coming. And again, it's a shame because none of this had to happen. None of this was a situation where the hand of either Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu was forced. So with that preface, we will launch into the 7 questions. And the first question is, what is the US Transhumanist Party's stance on this war? And I think I already elaborated upon it a bit, but primarily the US Transhumanist Party, in its 3rd core ideal, supports measures to use reason, science, and technology to reduce and eliminate existential risks facing the human species. And among the use of reason would be rational discourse. So what we're doing today. We want to understand the extent to which this war in Iran is increasing the existential risk to the human species and how perhaps humankind can walk back from the brink and mitigate that existential risk to the greatest extent possible. But needless to say, we are opposed to this war. There's no way in which this war would reduce the existential risk to the human species, as far as I can see now. Others can disagree and will engage with any disagreements as well. But for now, I would like to turn it over to Alan because he has some insights as well and some remarks that he has prepared. And Alan, of course, had served in the US military, so he has some insights from his time there as to both the strategy of the United States geopolitically as it has been historically, as well as options that the US government would have in reality to address threats like any threat that would have emanated from the Iranian regime without resorting to this kind of dramatic escalation. So, Alan, you have the floor. Please share with us any thoughts that you have. Alan, I think you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Yeah, thank you, Gennady. I want to say that I appreciate your brief and yet well-defined definition of our opposition as a party to war in general. I think that I think it does fall along a couple of lines, like you said, the self-determination and not meddling and avoiding existential risk, because in this case we're talking about nuclear weapon exchanges as opposed to just a singular attack. I'd like to say that, kind of as a preface to this, something that concerned me as I watched Fox News was this idea that this was an unprecedented daylight attack. And it struck me as odd that this attack daylight attack on Iran was, of course, conducted at night here in the USA. And so it leads me to question from whom it is we're hiding the attack. Additionally, I can think of no other action on our part that would have been a stronger as a unifying force for the people of Iran. I need to get that pronunciation correct. People of Iran and their government, which there has been a long rift there between the people of Iran and their government. And a little bit of context on that: the original overthrow of that government was done by us. So, by the United States of America. We went to a burgeoning and bustling modern country back in the 60s, and we overthrew the ruler there and put in the Shah of Iran. And then the collapse of the Shah was really what opened the door for Ayatollah Khomeini, the previous Ayatollah, who came in with a theocratic leadership, using tactics that you can see going on today in our own country. One thing Gianni didn't mention was specifically item 83 from our platform opposes the development of weapon systems that are capable of killing or injuring human beings. Basically, everybody says, autonomous robots. But we already use autonomous weapons and weapons that do not contain a human in the loop. And a good example of this are the drones, particularly the ground-driven drones in the Ukraine, which are triggered by sensors. So they put a drone in place with the weapon system pointing at an area, and when something comes into that area, it destroys it. That is kind of akin to booby trapping your house, which is also illegal in case somebody wanders in. Anyway, I don't know. But Iron Dome, I'll kind of backtrack a little brief history. I was in Iraq in 2003, 2004, 2006, and 2007. So I worked there a lot. And afterwards, I went to U.S. Central Command and worked there, which is the combatant command that covers that region of the world. And then subsequently went to, it covers that region of the world with the exception of Israel. But I subsequently went to U.S. Army Europe, which and worked with U.S. European Command, which is the combatant command that oversees Israel. Sort of an odd situation, but that's how we do it. Arab countries didn't want to be seen talking to Israel, and the Israelis didn't want to talk to the Arab nations. So those groups were separated based on the fact that it was the end of the end state of World War II to create a state in Israel there. But the U.S. Iron Dome over Israel, which is sort of, I keep hearing it on the news, and like I say, I watched Fox News tonight, just an unprecedented event was I watched Fox News tonight. They continue to call it Israel's Iron Dome, and said that their Iron Dome was ineffective. It had to be supported by our Aegis cruiser missile ships in the Mediterranean. I think what either they neglect to say or whatever is that we built the Iron Dome. The United States built the Iron Dome for Israel. It's operated by U.S. military forces. It uses a combination of ground radar, of ground-to-air surveillance radar, and satellite systems that project, that view what's going on the planet. It's also coordinated through NORAD in America, North American Command, Air Defense Command, which is basically comprised of U.S. and Canada, the only two nations involved in it, primarily us. And those systems are run by the United States. And when I was working at U.S. European, this is kind of a war story, but I was working at US European Command. We would regularly conduct drills, missile drills, based on this 20-minute flight time of a missile from Iran to Israel. And that was our constraint to confirm the launch, weed out multiple indicators. So when you multiple tracks of the same missile, we would have to deconflict that to really get an accurate count of how many missiles. And we would have to get the President of the United States on the phone. Typically, we got a staffer in the White House operations room. However, that happens at about minute 10 to minute 15. And they either get a yes or no to execute the full spectrum of, we call them defensive weapons, bit of an oxymoron, but basically weapons designed to shoot down other weapons. The Iron Dome in shorthand. So there are humans in that loop. And a lot of that is because of just the overload of technology that we have observing the area to sort through all that. We want to make sure it is as it looks like it is, and that our systems aren't being spoofed, and that the commander-in-chief actually makes the call on it, an elected member of our government. So, and we did that this time too. Obviously, the president was called and probably knew in advance because we launched the attack. We weren't responding to an attack. However, there's many things that we did that were not in keeping with the way we would normally defend our forces in a situation like this. We did not provide air defense missiles or radar to our bases in the region. We basically let them get hit. And I think that was a strategic call, sort of like Germany during the Cold War was those troops were considered the tripwire for mobilizing our national forces. And to really focus on that, I think, as you've heard before, or as Gennady said, and many others have said, usually we have a moral and ethical justification, and this time the only justification seems to be a distraction from bad poll numbers. I find it ironic that President Trump previously criticized Obama by saying, "Oh, his poll numbers are low. You can expect an attack on Syria or Iran anytime now." And now that Trump's poll numbers are low, he's literally attacking Iran. And I don't say that to bash the U.S. military. I was a part of it, and I think they're really good at breaking things and killing people, which is what they are. That's what they're for, and I would like them to be, and I would like our national leadership to recognize them as last resorts and not a first option. The skill with which the U.S. military executed the Maduro kidnapping, extraterritorial rendition, capture and brought to the world court, however you want to look at it, was near flawless. And what I'd like to tell you I'll tell you a little about the elements of power and the dime, how we drop the dime on other countries. But I'm sure that diplomatic, oh yeah, there we go. Thanks, Gennady. Diplomatic, informational, and military and economic resources. These are the instruments of national power. And that word instruments is key, because there's also something called the elements of national power. The elements are all those things that make a country great, right? Resources, geography, how well educated the people are, the government system. It's nebulous. Lots of different countries have their own definition of how they count that. But the way those are applied, how that as instruments comes across in these four forms. And you can see pretty clearly what they are. We have them embassies and ambassadors, negotiations, treaties, policies, and international form. All of that is diplomatic stuff. None of that I can, as far as my watching of the liberal media has shown any effort. We didn't do that. We just didn't do that. I'm not sure that we're operating on good information presently in our national decision making and sense making structure, and in the military operations, we fell short there too in providing defensive measures for our troops in the area. And then economically, this is the part that I think is most horrific, is that, as Gennady said, trade, flights, shipping, lots, movement of resources across the globe, all of it has been disrupted, and that's a vast economic disruption. My concern is that that is not a bug, that's a feature in this policy thinking. The feature is to disrupt and create an economic disruption, and then come in later and rebuild for a fee. This helps large multinational corporations. It helps wealthy individuals who are heavily invested in them. It does very little for the country at hand or the American people. Thanks. I don't know how long you want to leave that up. I'll keep talking now.
Yes. Thank you for sharing the dime graphic. Before you continue, Daniel Tweed wonders what the source of the graphic is.
I included that link. Can you post that link in the chat?
Yes, I will shortly. In the meantime, please continue.
Yeah, name of the magazine escapes me. Digital magazine. And I'm having my own issues that, there we go. Knocked my notes off the side. So yeah, as far as our policy on transhumanist policy on war, I think that in general we're against it. And I'll save my further remarks for the subsequent questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Alan, for your comments. And now we will go to Art Ramon as well before we elaborate on all of our respective remarks. But what are your thoughts, Art Ramon, on the situation in Iran, the war that was initiated by the Trump and Netanyahu administrations, and the appropriate outlook from the U.S. Transhumanist Party?
Well, most of it's been said, but what I notice is that both Ukraine and Iran are supposedly the breadbaskets of those areas. So no one's mentioned the control of food. And that's one of the conspiracies of a one world government eventually controlling the food supply. So I was looking at the Greater Israel Project, but Iran isn't in that. So only the fact, but it is the breadbasket, is what I heard. So yeah, food control, resource wars. I think maybe that's an angle that isn't really being looked at. It's all being through the lens of nuclear weapons, but maybe the breadbasket is food control. I think possibly is another motivator for attacking the country.
Yes, thank you, Art Ramon, for your comment. And we do have a source. We do have a source for the dime diagram, the diagram of instruments of national power that Alan showed. It is from Lightning Press, and here is the link to the page that includes that diagram. Also, in regard to the history of U.S. involvement in Iran, Daniel Tweed pointed this out in his comment, that back in 1953, the US administration at the time, this was under Dwight Eisenhower, overthrew the regime of Mossadegh in Iran. And this was replaced by Shah Mohammed. So this happened on August 19th, 1953. And what happened was the prime minister of Iran at the time, Mohammad Mossadegh, essentially tried to nationalize the oil industry of Iran. And the US, the British governments did not approve of this. So they staged this intervention and replaced Mossadegh by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who, in all fairness, was a better ruler than the Islamic Republic that followed. He was a modernizer. He was somebody who allowed a modicum of civil rights and women's rights, and also favored the westernization of Iran, its integration with the Western world, and a freer, let's say more classically liberal kind of world, but he was still somebody who ruled in an authoritarian manner. He was still somebody who repressed his critics, and ultimately he was unable to hold on to power. Even if he had good intentions, he was not able to stop the hardline Islamist fundamentalists from arising and ousting him in 1979 when he was already in poor health. And that was when the Islamic Republic of Iran was founded. And the Islamic Republic of Iran had been a thorn in the side of the United States government ever since its founding. A number of hostages were taken at the US embassy in Tehran during the Islamic Revolution, and Jimmy Carter was not able to successfully get those hostages released during his last days of his presidency, but Ronald Reagan managed to secure a release. And then from 1980 to 1988, there was a war between Iran and Iraq, where the United States actually covertly supported the regime of Saddam Hussein in that war in order to indirectly undermine the Iranian regime. But it's interesting that even in those actions, the US did not directly attack Iran. And in subsequent actions, until Donald Trump became president, and in 2020, Trump ordered a previous assassination of an Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, who was instrumental in arming some of these Iranian proxies like Hezbollah in the Middle East, and he was also operating in Iraq too to support militant groups there. So he was not friendly to the United States, but still an act such as the direct assassination of an Iranian general was seen as crossing a line. And the Iranian government did make a pro forma retaliation in early 2020. Fortunately, at that time, Donald Trump decided this was enough and chose not to escalate past that pro forma retaliation because the Iranian regime carefully calibrated it not to kill or injure US soldiers. So red lines keep being crossed. New precedents of very audacious and destructive actions are continually being set. And what was seen as an outrageous action, the killing of Soleimani back in 2020, now pales in comparison with just outright killing the leader of another country without due process, without saying, oh, he's accused of war crimes. We need to, first of all, overthrow him, then arrest him, then extradite him to stand trial or have him tried by his own people, as happened with Saddam Hussein. And whether or not any of that is legitimate, this was still at least a semblance of due process that doesn't exist anymore. So before we move on, we have some comments from our viewers. Jason Geringer writes, I think it would be nice if we had a president that didn't break the law. That would be nice, huh? Yes, well, I hope we can get back to that. And ultimately, this is a goal that all of us Americans will need to pursue. How to attain a presidency and the status of the presidency that is once again constrained by the US Constitution and isn't just wildly outside the bounds of it, isn't just functioning on the principle of might makes right. And then we also have a comment from Agroforesters Guild. The US seems unable to resist the idiotic pursuit of the title of world's police. And this was where US foreign policy had gotten into a lot of trouble over the past several decades. And I would include, for instance, the bombing of Belgrade in Serbia in response to the conflict in Kosovo, the invasion of Iraq and the occupation of Iraq, which also had some humanitarian rationales behind it. Saddam Hussein was a dictator who was oppressing his people. Similarly, the intervention in Libya. So, indeed, this temptation to be the world police can fuel situations where the United States government can just say, oh, this leader of a country, he was a bad guy, he was authoritarian, therefore it's within our rights to remove him. But US leaders are not perfect either. And somebody could make a case. Indeed, people within the United States have made the case that Trump is an authoritarian, that Trump is a bad guy. Does that give some other power the right to attack the United States and forcibly remove Donald Trump or assassinate Donald Trump? As much as we are opposed to Trump and his policies at this stage, I think none of us watching this stream would condone that kind of action. So I think we need to be consistent and oppose it when it's done with other countries and their leaders. Jennifer Hughes, who was our endorsed mayoral candidate in 2021 for Camden, New Jersey, writes the USTP is opposed to all wars. She also writes, war is the biggest waste of lives and resources, period. All the wars, all of them impede the progress and abundance of Earth and all people. Thank you, Jennifer, for your comments. And then Kevin Bransaforty states that the Google AI overview says that while the heavy attacks on Iran were occasionally scheduled for night, they were actually started at about 9:40 a.m. local time. And we can only speculate as to the reason for that. It could be they just needed more time to get everything together. They weren't quite ready to go. But as Alan pointed out, maybe it could be that they didn't want the American people to find out until later. I found out when I woke up on Saturday, and it was a bit surreal for a few minutes. When I saw the headlines, I was trying to figure out, is this accurate? Is this actually happening? Because it was not my impression that this kind of timetable would be followed. But there is a prior occasion where this happened. In advance of the 12-day war, Donald Trump gave the Iranian regime 2 weeks to come to a nuclear deal, essentially. And on the third day after issuing that ultimatum, the American and Israeli strikes on the Fordo facility occurred. So in reality, there was no 2-week period. And that kind of decision, I think, greatly undermines trust. If you tell someone you have X amount of time, and then you act preemptively before that time period elapses, who is going to want to negotiate with you in the future? Who is going to want to risk it when they will perceive any sort of negotiation, any sort of conversation as a ruse, when in reality you could strike them at any moment? So that is concerning as well, that even explicitly there was no statement that the regime in Iran had crossed a red line and now all negotiations have broken down. Daniel Tweed also writes, the supreme leader who was killed, Ali Khamenei, actually was more moderate on Iran getting nukes. The runner-up leader is reportedly committed to getting Iran atomic bombs. And indeed, Khamenei had been on record saying, even several years ago, that a nuclear weapon should never be used. I think he would have been a supporter of getting nuclear weapons as a deterrent, but not as weapons of aggression. So, yes, just because somebody is the leader of a regime or a hostile entity does not mean that person is the most radical or the most extreme or the most fanatical person within that hostile entity. And just killing the leader does not destroy the regime. The regime in Iran is a system, and there are people in high places within that regime who are ideologically dedicated to it. So killing an 86-year-old man who already was not the most active person is not going to force the kind of regime change that Trump and Netanyahu were intent upon. So with that discussion, Alan, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I kind of chomping at the bit. That's one reason I wanted to introduce the dime principle, because those levers of power, they work in concert. When they work best, they work in concert. And so it's important not to undermine the diplomatic trust that you've built in a region by lying, or however you want to look at it, whatever, by sort of doing the surprise attack trick with your in your negotiations, by setting that up with your negotiations. That undermines the diplomatic mode. It's poor communication. It's not a good way to put out information about our own government to the rest of the world. It has devastating economic effects, and additionally, I mean, it also makes military operations more difficult. So that's I mean, very pragmatic on my part to say that, but yeah, the thing is, as Jennifer Hughes pointed out, that war is destructive. It's not the kind of a thing that you can turn on and off and everything's okay again. That it destroys trust, it destroys infrastructure, and it literally even the infrastructure of our planet is threatened by nuclear weapons, but it also kills people, which is probably our greatest resource. So I think I think those are really. That's why I kind of want to introduce that dime. Look at if our audience are members of the Transhumanist Party and anyone else who's tuning in. Use those principles of diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. Those are the ways we apply our power. And yeah, I mean, Luis, I love you, brother. And it is stupid to be the policeman of the world. I mean, it's but we had a unique opportunity at the end of the Second World War to do just that, to be the policeman of the world. And we got together with several other nations, all Western European nations, and even some Asians nations. And we chose this agreement that we would be the policeman of the world. However, we did not parlay that into, other than NATO, a collective security agreement for the world that would involve not having wars. So I think that was a real failure on our leadership to simply sit back and rest upon the laurels of those that had come out of a war, had real experience with the horrors of war, and then we're just going to ride out the peace for 50, 60 years, and then suffer the consequences later, which is what we're doing now. We're suffering the consequences of spending too long as a policeman and not using those other levers of power as diplomatic and economic engines to bring the rest of the world up to the U.S. standard and all the great things that we could have done. Gone to the moon and all the other great things, right? We kind of just left off all the other great things. So
Yes.
that's my 2 cents on that. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Alan. And to go along with that, Daniel Tweet writes, if you have to go to war, you have already lost. And he thinks that's in The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And interestingly enough,
Good
we
paraphrase.
spoke with George Chanos, the author, futurist, former Attorney General of Nevada, on February 15th for a virtual Enlightenment salon. And George Chanos pointed out that the government of China is very much informed by Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And this means, in my view, China is very unlikely to initiate a war against the United States because there is that thinking that if you have to go to war, you've already lost. So they will try every other possible stratagem before resorting to war. I worry more about the US initiating a preemptive war against China the way that now seems to be a pattern, with first Venezuela, a small targeted military police action, and then Iran, a much larger war. But what if that war succeeds? It's strange to say this, that the success of a war like this could embolden the United States to launch a bigger war. And that would truly be a world war. And that would truly be disastrous for all of human civilization. So I hope it doesn't happen. I hope that more people in the West read Sun Tzu. And also, together we can share 23 compliments you, Alan, on a good overview of Dime. So thank you very much. I think that's our friend Steel Archer. So welcome, Steel. It's been some time, but we're always glad to see you on our streams. And Luis Arroyo states, let us remember transhumanists are internationalists. And yes, although we're the US Transhumanist Party, transhumanism is a global movement. And we have viewers right now from all over the world. And we have members in the USTP. Our allied members constitute 30% of our membership. So while we do respect national sovereignty, national laws, constitutions in the world in which we find ourselves, we do hope for a future world where those distinctions will become increasingly less consequential, not because there's necessarily any sort of coercive restructuring into a world government, but because there will be freedom of movement, there will be freedom of trade, there will be the exchange of ideas, people will get to know people from other countries. And these ties, the economic, cultural, societal ties, will be so strong that people will not think of going to war against other countries. So countries will become more like administrative divisions of humanity with their own distinct flavors and histories and cultures, but there won't be this geopolitical opposition, this constant war of all against all. And that is a future toward which transhumanists aspire and seek to apply their talents. But it's a future that hopefully can resonate with the rest of humankind. And I will make some quotations from the US Transhumanist Party platform as well while we're on the subject. So Section 83 of the USTP platform, which Alan cited, includes this statement: the United States Transhumanist Party opposes any development or deployment of weapons systems that are capable of killing or injuring human beings in the absence of an explicit command by a human being to take action in every specific instance. So that has been the case with even drones until very recently, but I think autonomous weapons, truly autonomous weapons, would be a danger on an entirely different level, because a lot of damage could occur even without anyone intending to inflict it because of some sort of targeting error on the part of the autonomous weapons system. And there wouldn't be a human in the loop to correct that, which would be alarming. So then We also have Section
120
of the USTP platform, which was recently adopted in March of last year. The United States Transhumanist Party supports restrictions on the ability to use AI systems for intentionally destructive purposes. Such restrictions would include a ban on autonomous weapons. So AI needs to be a technology of peace, of human progress, of human flourishing, not a technology to intentionally destroy lives and property and infrastructure. So now I think it would be good to move on to our second question. So how would transhumanist policies have led to different, more peaceful outcomes? So of course, the DIME framework that Alan described is an excellent one for thinking about this. And Alan, I'll bring up the DIME framework once again, and I'll invite you to opine on how could this have been different if, let's say, you or somebody with your level of experience with how the military works, how some of these foreign policy approaches and levers work, how would you approach the situation where there is a regime that is problematic, that has threatened the US before, or funded adversaries or funded hostile groups, but they're not openly at war with the US right now. And they say they don't want war, but they're developing covertly a nuclear weapons program and they're reluctant to abandon it. How would you address this within the DIME framework?
That's a great question, and I there's so much I want to say about that. Let's see. I'm not sure where to start. I think that our ability to address those problems and how we would reach more certainly peaceful outcomes, but also more democratic self-rule sort of outcomes around the globe. It comes from a couple of different things. When in Iraq, there was two arguments in a discussion, and one was sort of the economic argument, which was we come in here, we break everything, and then we come back and we fix everything, and then we build a Walmart and declare victory. The other one was much more about that one, as you can see, is sort of geared toward what we want to accomplish. But the other, when it comes to how, there was what was called a whole of government approach, as opposed to strictly a military approach in problem solving. And this remained true later in my career when I was at U.S. European Command for several issues that came up. This whole of government approach, and which was, I'll give you an example from Iraq, is that yes, we were looking for weapons of mass destruction, primarily binary chemical artillery rounds, but also, so who did we have there? We had soldiers doing a lot of that, but the other agency we had there was the Department of Energy, because they're the ones that have all of the abilities to find radiological weapons and things like that. So they, it's typically the military is not coordinating with the Department of Energy. Likewise, shout out to Luis, the New York Police Department was very influential in getting problems solved in Iraq because of their experience with the Twin Tower terrorism event. They had a very robust capacity to deal with that, more robust than the U.S. military, and perhaps even still. So rarely do you see the military coordinating with the New York Police Department or the FBI or the well, I forget what they are, the Federal Airplane Commission, whatever the guys, the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. They were instrumental in controlling airspace in our country and outside of our nation. So those folks were really good at these things. And that expanded, it was a whole of government approach to getting problem solved. And that is We seem to be doing less and less of that now. Other than the bag man did the bribes down in Venezuela, I mean, that was strictly a military operation. So well done, well run military operation. Glad they did it. Glad we got Maduro off the streets and closer to the Hague by virtue of the next closest court, the UN. But those types of operations are strictly military. But if we use a whole of government approach, we can address, thanks to Art Ramon, saying the food shortage war, water wars, food wars, those types of conflicts might well be addressed by the Department of Transportation here in the U.S. or the Department of Agriculture to actually develop a strategy for how we feed the world, as opposed to letting the shareholders or Marcher Daniels Midland determine that. And don't get me wrong, I got no problem with Archer Daniels Midland getting their cut for doing the work, but I think it would be nice to have some of those things actually reviewed the way military operations get reviewed and on a strategic level of how we can use our whole of government to actually influence the world for the better, right? Oh, I had more on that, but I think I've gotten on it. That's what you get. Thank you for asking me to opine. Let me see if I had some notes on that.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I would add also that if you have a whole of government approach, you need to involve the branches of government that have constitutional authority and oversight over these activities. And the role of Congress cannot be overemphasized in this particular situation. Legitimately speaking, according to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, the Congress shall have power to declare war, and also even to grant letters of marque and reprisal and make rules concerning captures on land and water. So even in the Maduro situation, Congress needed to authorize that kind of action to capture Maduro, or, for instance, to intercept the vessels that came from Venezuela that were alleged to be carrying drugs, illegal drugs, but we're never going to know if they actually did because those vessels were not boarded. Their cargo was not searched. They were just obliterated. And when certain vessels were disabled, they weren't boarded. They were struck again, and the people on them were killed. And that to me is quite suspicious, because what was the Trump administration or Pete Hegseth and his discretion as the so-called Secretary of War trying to conceal by just killing these individuals, destroying these boats instead of allowing them to be inspected? Would an inspection have shown perhaps that there wasn't this kind of illicit cargo on these boats, and that these operations therefore were not having the intended effect? So I would say with any sort of transhumanist administration, we would follow the Constitution. And if there were a situation where there was a hostile regime, we would require that there be a debate in Congress. We would require that any sort of proposal to take any sort of military action be put for a vote of Congress, as is necessitated by the letter of the Constitution. And along these lines, we have a comment from Kevin Bransaforti. It really should be the stance of the U.S. Transhumanist Party to repeal the 1973 War Powers Act, which was passed by Congress over the veto of Richard Nixon. So the War Powers Act, interestingly enough, Nixon didn't want it, but the War Powers Act gave the president the ability to launch these kinds of unilateral attacks. And Jason also agrees in the chat. He says, yes, we should follow the Constitution. That's his main point. And Mike Lazine says, agreed, Gennady, and that is why our party, with our party allies like the Pirate Party, makes us a superior choice to the GOP and Democrats. Yes, it's interesting because the Democrats have not really been vocal yet about the attack on Iran. So the Democrats supposedly would have good reason to oppose Trump here and call for a vote of Congress, call for a debate, and maybe they will. But we've seen previously, say during the Biden administration, how the anti-war, let's say, tendencies that were observed as the Iraq War became protracted in the mid to late 2000s didn't really carry over after that. So the Democrats, interestingly enough, when they came into power under both Obama and then under Biden, stopped invoking any sort of anti-war rhetoric. So it was Obama who organized the intervention in Libya. It was Obama who was talking about interventions in Syria. It was Biden who was sending arms and funding to Ukraine. So I think the Democrats have generally been opposed to wars waged under Republican administrations. But even now, when they should have partisan political reasons to oppose this war, what I'm seeing so far is lackluster. And I think they still have a chance to become more vocal. I hope that they do. But there has been so much of just, let's call it Trump acceptance recently, that whatever Trump is doing is just seen as the new normal. And very few people are now standing up to him on principle. They may be saying, oh, he's playing for a different side and we don't like that. But where are the anti-war activists that were so prominent in the mid-2000s and the late 2000s? Where is even the MAGA anti-war activist base? Because Trump himself campaigned on a platform of no new wars in the Middle East. So that is a blatant violation of his own campaign promise. Just like in pretty much every other respect, he's been acting contrary to his campaign promises. And it's perplexing that his base is not holding him to account on that. But maybe that is going to change. I hope it does. So we have a bit of commentary in the chat. So Mike DeVerde, Agroforesters Guild, says no repeal of the War Powers Act. Kevin Bransaforti says the War Powers Act has given 11 administrations 60 days to act before Congress needs to be involved, and that's the problem. So we need Congress to actually do its job under the Constitution and to be allowed to do its job and to be able to either authorize or deny authorization for the executive branch to take military action. Because the 60-day time period, I think probably some part of Trump hopes that within 60 days this will all be over and the Iranian regime will be overthrown and he'll be dealing with whatever the new leadership is. But in all reality, I have my doubts as to whether it can happen so quickly, because this is not just a personalist regime the way Maduro's regime was. And even with Maduro, so Maduro was removed, but Trump was willing to tolerate his successor, Delcy Rodriguez. And he was willing to leave in power the whole Chavismo regime, because really what Trump wanted was to get the resistance that Maduro presented to his agenda out of the way. Trump doesn't care about a more classically liberal or democratic or humane regime in Venezuela. He just wanted to get a political rival out of the way, and then he told Delcy Rodriguez, okay, you had better cooperate or the same thing will happen to you. Now, with the Iranian regime, he can't really do that because he is dealing with some hardline theocrats. So they're not just going to fold. If they fold, their own people will make short work of them. So,
Right.
as Daniel Tweed also says, you can do a lot of damage in 60 to 90 days in the course of a war. We would want Congress to be able to act more quickly. So I think this was a good discussion of our second question. And we can continue to pick up some of these threads of conversation as the salon advances, but I also want to address the other questions. So, how will this war affect the likelihood of a transhumanist future for humanity being attained within the next several decades? And this is important to consider because every time there's this kind of major conflict or major turmoil, I become concerned not just about the loss of lives or the destruction of infrastructure, but the redirection of human energies away from innovation and creation and toward destruction, toward maybe eventually overcoming the destruction, repairing the damage, but that takes a while. It took decades for Europe to rebuild after World War II. And I know, for instance, Ray Kurzweil, in his books, the latest of which is this one, The Singularity is Nearer, presented data that progress in certain technologies, such as, say, information technology, computing power, was not adversely affected by World War II or other geopolitical conflicts. But that presupposed a world in which there was, roughly speaking, a good side to those conflicts, in the sense that in World War II, it's pretty clear what the good side was, with all of the flaws that happened, say, the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States, or the British firebombing of Dresden, or the Soviet Union and its regime. Still, those flawed actors, in my view, were immeasurably better than Hitler and the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany or even by Imperial Japan. So, in a situation where there are still good guys who are motivated to resist evil, there could be progress made. But in a situation where that's no longer clear at all, it's just might makes right. And the principles that also limited to a certain extent what could be done in war, the kind of destruction that could be inflicted in war, have gone out the window. What is left? What is left to prevent this situation from devolving into this Hobbesian state of nature, the war of all against all? So that is concerning. Can this derail the progress of technologies and, more importantly, their availability to ordinary people so as to improve our standard of living, improve our productive and creative capabilities? Or is Kurzweil going to end up being right even here? Will there still be progress in certain technological fields, like especially in military technology? What if the military or the militaries of various countries perceive a use for, say, accelerating artificial intelligence or accelerating the build out of space infrastructure for military purposes? Those could be, say, defensive purposes, defense against nuclear weapons, or bases in space. Maybe the Space Force will become more formidable in the years to come. So one can be of two minds about this question of whether a war like this will retard progress in the ways that we care about. And I would also add, what about civilian scientific research, biological research, research into medicine and life extension? On the one hand, maybe there could be some research into medicine for troops if they're injured in combat. Antibiotics became widely used during World War II, and they saved a lot of lives of injured soldiers. However, the longer term research endeavors to discover, for instance, how to reverse aging, which would require lengthy studies on both animals and humans. Could that be derailed? Say Israel. Israel has a vibrant scientific research infrastructure. It's actually really sad that this research infrastructure is in a conflict zone because a lot of Israeli universities, research labs, institutions are being targeted right now. So how would that affect the rate of progress of longevity research? All of these are open questions, and I would invite commentary. So, Alan, if you have thoughts on this set of questions.
I do, thanks. Yeah, we've discussed this before in some degree. I don't like my answer. I'm not real comfortable with it. But the production of wounded and dismembered soldiers, for example, more likely to come out of the Ukraine than this situation, but provide an exceptional opportunity for prosthetics research. And that would significantly improve lifespan over time, since the war will end, and I'll discuss phase 0 later, but the innovations that are made. And I think that's also the case with the Second World War, with things like the Enigma machine. And you talked about computing. Not only was it not hindered by the Second World War, it was accelerated by the Second World War. And in addition to that, IBM's ability to track names and addresses enabled the Nazis to find and locate Jewish people so they could round them all up in one night. Kristallnacht, or the Night of Breaking Glass, it's called. So that accelerated, in that case, technology accelerated the warfare. But coming out of that was the Enigma machine. And yeah, as much as I don't like the notion of it, people being wounded in ways that we can now fix with prosthetics will drive that science forward. Just a telling difference in the technology. When the Greeks and the Romans went to war, they had developed different styles of fighting. The Greeks used pikes that they would stab into their opponents, and then they would clash, and deaths came from being pierced with a spear. But the Romans used skirmishers with short swords to attack those formations from the side, and they would chop off people's arms or legs. And after the first battle, when the wounded returned to Athens, missing limbs, something they had never seen before, they were so shocked that they capitulated. Rome, being an empire, had no interest in governing them, just receiving tribute. So they pretty much got to run themselves anyway. Not really a good situation, but just this is going to happen. And I think that this technology, while not the biological, the biomechanical interface side of it, where else would one test this? I mean, nobody's volunteering for the research. But I'll stop there for now.
Indeed. Well, I would hope that prosthetic technology gets tested on people who are paralyzed or harmed in accidents, say industrial accidents or household accidents. But to your point, wars create many more such individuals, unfortunately. But maybe they could benefit to a greater extent than their predecessors in similar situations would have. Now, Katie Clark writes on this question, the timeline gets derailed when tools built to extend human potential get captured by institutions that trade lives for position. Are we building capacity fast enough? But she also says, Alan, I don't think your opinion is bad. It's not wrong to use the reality of something outside our control to advance science to better everyone. Luis Arroyo writes, war is innovation, but in a certain way. So the innovation gets channeled in certain directions, in the directions of military hardware, for instance, or technologies that are more responsive to the battlefield, less toward, let's say, civilian applications. But it's possible that later on, after a war ends, after the dust settles, some of those innovations could be repurposed for civilian use. Still, it would seem that pursuing the civilian applications directly is an easier path. It's a more
Yes.
it's a more expeditious path. So Daniel Tweed also writes that his dad would have died from his Battle of the Bulge intestinal wounds were it not for the mass production of penicillin. And it's worth it to note, as deadly and destructive as World War II was, because of the medical innovations that were already available at that time, it was a lot less destructive than it could have been. So in World War I, for instance, a lot of soldiers died from infections that they acquired in the trenches. And in World War II, more of the deaths were in active combat. People who got these kinds of infections or diseases could be treated more readily. And on the other hand, Mike Lezine writes, well, governments in control of AI is a recipe for disaster. So if AI progress for military applications for autonomous weapons is accelerated as a result of these wars, and various world powers come to believe that they absolutely need to develop AI and need to develop autonomous weapons technologies, well, that's going to lead to this runaway escalation where increasingly the great powers may use fully autonomous weapons to target their enemies and cause more damage than any human would have decided to do or wanted to do. Now, Daniel Tweed has an interesting recommendation. We ought to phrase these questions as prediction market bets. I think our friend Dr. Robin Hanson, who was a guest on our virtual Enlightenment salons on 2 occasions, would agree with that. That would be part of his futarchy concept of essentially a government where decisions are made based on the outcomes of prediction markets. Steele Archer wrote, we need to keep up open source themes and avoid capture. I think he means avoiding capture of the technologies by governments or closed source institutions so that technological innovation can occur in the civilian space and with oversight by people, oversight by markets, channeling the development of these technologies toward the good of all or many people. And Mike Lezine writes that his grandparents on both his parents' sides were in World War II, so perhaps they also experienced a lot of the hardships of that war, but were aided by the technologies that were already available. So, Art Ramon, any thoughts on this third question? How would this war affect essentially progress toward a transhumanist future? Will it derail the progress or not really impact it?
Oops. So go ahead and change it back. Okay. Unfortunately, I think war drives innovation, and it's grim, but that's the case. Eventually, I mean, what are you going to end up with? Just robots fighting each other to control resources and land? I mean, you're not going to have enough soldiers to fight the drones and the robots. So eventually, it's going to be battle bots, basically. Battle bots to gain control over territory and resources. So, yeah, and that's going to drive, innovation with robotics. And yeah, I mean, we've already made a lot of progress, but once they're out in the field destroying each other, I mean, think about it. They captured Maduro with supposedly some sort of directed energy weapon that made everyone, get sick. Some ultrasonic weapon or whatever. Imagine when you have those in drones flying around to control the population, to control riots and protests, having little drones running around with these ultrasonic, pacifiers, making everyone throw up and crap themselves. I mean, that's innovation, not necessarily the kind we would like to see. It's dystopian. But it nonetheless, it's innovation, and hopefully we can turn that outwards to external threats. Is my hope, is that eventually we'll just quit, fighting each other, and hopefully defend ourselves from external threats. That's my hope. That the innovation is going to go towards that direction, whether it's a aggressive alien race or asteroids or whatever. The development of Space Force to protect the planet. So that's my hope.
Yes, and that is actually a hopeful future that you outline, where innovations in military technology will lead warfare to be primarily waged by robots and ultimately essentially lead humankind to coalesce to, let's say, focus its actual damage dealing capabilities against external threats. And interestingly enough, along these lines, I wrote a short story back in 2007, a more optimistic time, called The Fate of War, which is based on essentially that premise that over time, humans have essentially come to understand that Yes. So, in regard to this short story, which I pulled up, it is a story about a future where essentially human beings have decided the autonomous weapons technology has advanced so much that humans don't stand a chance against robots. And as a result of that, they decided to delegate the fighting of war to robots. So instead of humans fighting each other or humans fighting robots, the robots are fighting the robots. And this is a distant future. I pulled up the story, and I would encourage you to take a look at it, but I'll read to you the first paragraph of it just to give you a sense of how I envisioned that future back then. So it begins as follows. Important public announcement to all virtual travelers. I, Andrew the 109th autonomous proprietor, shall be having a war this evening at 7 p.m. against my friend Marcus the 88th autonomous proprietor. 3 planets are at stake, renowned for fine vineyards and rich metal deposits. The war shall be waged in virtual realm 756C with virtual combat automata using arms and armor from the Roman period. With permission of the Intergalactic Commission for the Regulation of Warfare, I have reserved said virtual realm for combat activities. Observation of the war is permitted from neighboring planes 756A and 756B, though placing monetary bets is only permitted in realm 756B. Proprietor Marcus the 88th and I kindly request all other virtual activities in the aforementioned realms to temporarily cease. The war's loser is legally bound to compensate economic losses to all parties whose interests are adversely impacted by this restriction. The war shall last until one of the proprietors surrenders, one side's electronic automata are wiped out, or 4 hours expire, whichever is soonest. At 11 p.m. tonight, proprietor Marcus the 88th and I invite all observers to join us at the 981st Intergalactic Cafe for tea and dessert. We will also be profoundly grateful to any observers who subsequently create and spread news documentaries covering the war so as to promote the individual glory of the winner. Notice approved by the Intergalactic Commission for the Regulation of Warfare, October 17th, 4324. So war in this future becomes so stylized and regimented and bound by these conventions that it's no longer actually about hostility. It's no longer actually about inflicting damage. And the rest of the story is about how war evolves to get to that point. So what I'm curious about from our panel is, do you see any sort of path from here to there, from our present where wars are tremendously destructive to a future where that fate of war is indeed the one that is realized. Now, note in that short story, I situated 2,300 years hence. So a lot of other events could happen in the meantime. But any thoughts, either Alan or Art Ramon?
And it reminds me of Player of Games by Ian M. Banks, who talks less about the game and more about the players. So, but it's a very interesting book. I recommend it to everyone. Gennady, I think it'd be next to wonderful, although it has its, there's its drawbacks. I wouldn't want to see the prime minister in Norway and President Trump, doing the Rochambeau for Greenland, right? I mean, it's just, but there are instances of that presently. Canada, and I think it's Norway, have a dispute over an island. It's a little rock, basically. And so what they'll do is to mark who's claimed the island, their warship, small warship, will go up there and put a bottle of, I think it's Canadian whiskey in one case, and then Norway comes back to get it's their latest wine, tulip wine or something, and it goes back and forth like that, and has for decades. So I mean that's a dream, that's I think it's great. That's especially, I think it would still require a little human wisdom, not to just make it transactional and super fast, but sounds like a wonderful future to me.
Indeed. And a future to aspire toward. Jason writes, honestly, robots fighting robots sounds better to him than humans killing humans. Jennifer Hughes writes, of war, it's also dumb and such a waste of lives and resources. Katie Clark writes, I think what concerns me the most about the idea described of future wars of bots versus bots is that we as humans put such little regard for artificial life of any capacity. So what if those robots become sentient? That's an interesting scenario to explore as well. And yes, if there's any probability of emergent sentience from sufficiently complex AI systems, then the battle bots would need to be designed so as not to be able to approach that sentience, so as not to have it emerge. Otherwise, it will be another situation where essentially autonomous beings with rational capability, consciousness, self-awareness are fighting one another. And then they might say, well, the humans programmed us to do it, but we really regret this situation. And then Daniel Tweed states, or that classic Star Trek episode, The Taste of Armageddon, where people walked into disintegration chambers after virtual war strikes, where they didn't destroy the infrastructure, but they still, for whatever reason, wanted to have the actual death of humans, which doesn't make sense to me. But I remember that episode well, and Captain Kirk put an end to it. Interestingly enough, notwithstanding the prime directive, Captain Kirk did put an end to a lot of irrational and destructive practices among the alien civilizations that he visited. And then Jason, in response to Jason, Mike Lazine writes, it makes me think of the Voltron Vehicle Force cartoons where the Alliance had robots to fight against the Drool Empire's robots and robot ships. So there is, I think, some precedent for this in science fiction. Jennifer Hughes writes, I think it's pretty important we also stay focused on the world that we want to see. And hence I brought up this possible scenario of how war could evolve in beneficial ways. But again, we are far away from that. And to Alan's point, we need the wisdom, we need the rationality, we need the desire to move in that direction. So very good discussion of question 3. And now let us move on to the next question. Are the goals of transhumanists in jeopardy because of seemingly unceasing militaristic geopolitical tendencies? That is to say, as we just discussed, we have this vision for a brighter world, a more humane world, a more internationally connected world where there is less of an inclination toward conflict. And of course, a world of abundance, a world of technological progress, of longer lifespans, of greater opportunities for everybody. But it seems like the militarists don't share in those goals. It seems that they actually see a lot of the world as zero sum. Trump certainly does. He is always in this mindset of, if I win, somebody else has to lose. Or if we're not, quote, winning, if we're not number one, then somebody is taking advantage of us. Like any type of situation, say with global commerce, for Trump is a zero sum game. He thinks, well, if we're importing cheap goods from China, it's because China is taking advantage of us somehow. So that is a troubling kind of mindset. And it is not the mindset that transhumanists hold. Transhumanists hold to a positive sum mindset where essentially through trade, through cultural exchange, through cooperation, we can all be better off. And we don't have to fight and kill and destroy one another. We instead need to, as Art Ramon pointed out in his most recent comments, focus our common energies on the real threats to the human condition, the existential risks, say the asteroids, the diseases, the various geological phenomena, weather phenomena in the future, potentially larger scale phenomena that could happen to planets or solar systems. So, is enough of the world even thinking in this way right now? Or are the zero sum thinkers essentially not just in power, but so culturally influential that they're derailing the goals of transhumanists? Any thoughts, either Art Ramon or Alan?
I can go. Well, or emphasis on peace, yes. Technological advancement, no. So yeah. You hear there's a lot of regionalism, going from globalism to regionalism, and that part of that's because of the resource war that's going to happen. Resources are going to dwindle. You need it to grow, so you're going to have regionalism. Eventually, these regions could compete against each other, but at the same time, create methods of creating resources out of thin air, so you don't have to worry about fighting over the resources. So then war can just become a sport where like the robot jocks fight, the big robots just fight each other. It becomes a sport. And that way it continues to innovate as a sport in case we need to project that militarism outwards. So that's kind of what I think.
Very interesting. So turn those militaristic tendencies into sport competitions. And sport competitions are zero sum too, according to the rules. So if you have, say, a basketball game or a football game, one side wins, the other loses. But in a way, today's sports, today's public entertainment that bears the name of sports is a huge improvement over, say, the ancient Roman gladiatorial games. So there has been some channeling of those kinds of energies, particularly many people wanting to pick a side and cheer for that side and cheer for the defeat of the other side. But those energies have been channeled into a controlled, more peaceful setting, essentially. So perhaps even someone like Donald Trump could be persuaded to focus on the sports more than on the actual destruction. Rumors are that he plans some sort of boxing cage match for his 80th birthday, so he has some of those tendencies. But Jason Geringer makes an important point. He says, I think a transhumanist future is inevitable, but the restructuring of the world order is definitely a setback. So that's Jason's opinion. And it matters when the transhumanist future will arrive. I think it matters for us because that will determine when the technologies are available to reverse our own aging. And we don't have centuries to wait in this regard. That's why I think this is an important conversation to be having, because we want to reach the good timeline. The good timeline is one in which we all benefit from age reversal technologies arriving in time for us. So, Alan, any thoughts on your part as to whether we might be derailed in our goals from this? Let's see.
There we go. Yeah, thank you. I do. First, to Art's comment about the sport. I mean, I think the Olympic Games were at one point in time that. And essentially, you have your best rock throwers and your best spear throwers, and you show, hey, our guys won. Don't go to war with us this year. Right? I think that's not a bad idea. Or every 4 years, or whatever it takes. I think that's wonderful. Yeah, and I think we need to maybe restructure the way we look at entertainment. And in regards to that paradigm of winner and loser, I think is missed if there's not a third party who's a stakeholder. And so in a sporting event, like you mentioned, that there's the crowd, and they're winners or losers too, in a sense, in the same event, right? Their champions prevailed or were defeated. And yet everybody walks away, unless it's a soccer game and then there's a bloody fight after. But I think that's a great analogy to use, the sports analogy, and whether that is channeling something that's in our inner nature or something that we can overcome over time. Well, I'll leave that for the neuroscientist. But to answer more directly this question of this, is our goals of transhumanism in jeopardy because of this unceasing military geopolitical tendencies? That's not the one we're on, though, is it? Sorry.
Yes, that is the one we're on. So
okay, okay, all right, yeah,
pull that up.
There we go. I think it's dependent on how well our nation, including our government and industry and attitudes, shift into more of a democratic and whole of government approach, both for national and international problem solving. And I think somebody said it earlier. First time I've heard it was tonight. This districts of humanity, right? Like, yeah, well, we have this district of humanity has a conflict with the other district of humanity. What's the best way? Is it a soccer game? Maybe. But I think I think there's more stakeholders than just those two, especially if it's going to be, 20 yards with nuclear weapons or something, right? Those kind of mock combats, or that's really a poor way to think of it. It's more like a sporting event, right? It needs to be a festive occasion. But anyway, I'm thinking it needs to be problem solving based on reason at the bottom line, right? It's problem solving based on reason. And that'll get us a lot farther out of jeopardy than, rational problem solving, whether that's what we have now for whatever reason it is, or whether it's just corrosive thinking or poor thinking on the part of the leadership. But it is up to us to a large degree, each one of us, I say, and it's up to humanity. Going back to Jason's point about have we just set back humanity? I mean, I don't know. And I think when I first encountered military, government, and academic circles talking about how do we transition into a new world, right? A new world order upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, what do we need to do? And that was 1986 when I first started that, was brought into that discussion. And it was just a few years later that the Soviet Union collapsed, the wall came down, whatever, they were 89. And yet we never had that discussion nationally. That was never brought to the agenda as a popular discussion topic. Seems like that really could have been. And I think that that's about the date that we really should have had things better organized right on the world. Because we had 1950 to 1980, this 30 years to get stuff done. Like I know Dan has told the story of the road situation, how they built that out over 30 years. But as we move forward, I mean, I think these shifts, what we've done, we've used diplomacy to kind of ride those benefits and push that decision point farther and farther down the road about how are we going to restructure our world order. And you can see what we're doing is maybe not the best way to restructure it. We're just basically entrenching ourselves in our own little countries. And then if we think they're getting ahead of us, we just bomb them. Not a good way to travel forward. So, but this change has been coming and it's been on the horizon for people since the 80s. And yeah, we're still not through the transition. We have prolonged this transition as long as possible, and it's going to change. And I think it's, like I say, when I say it's up to us how to drive that change in the right direction.
Yes.
We can talk about that in every other salon. So.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Alan. And Luis Arroyo writes, a good timeline needs to be won or created. And that is aligned with your comments that this is up to us. And in terms of various timelines, Mike DeVerde writes, militaristic tendencies lead inevitably to cyberpunk futures, not solar punk ones. So hopefully we do have control over where that goes, or at least the ability to influence it. But that's where influencing mindsets is key, because the zero-sum mentality, including the one that has captured the minds of a lot of leaders of world countries today, that can be changed, hopefully, either by electing a new crop of leaders, or even in some circumstances persuading the existing ones to the extent that that may be feasible. So now let us move on to question 5. What are the risks arising from this war in regard to escalation of global tensions and entanglement of the United States in another perpetual conflict? And we did discuss this as well in the Salon of June 22nd, 2025. But along these lines, Kevin Bransaforti poses this question. Iran is a major supplier of weapons to Russia in its war against Ukraine. Do you think these airstrikes will help weaken Russia's ability to wage war? Jason Geringer writes, sure, this can't be good for Russia, but I think it's going to take the Russian economy to tank to end that war. So the view that I have on this is, yes, Iran has been an ally of Putin's government, and it has supplied drones, which have been instrumental to the Russian war effort. But I don't think this will be decisive to the Russian war effort, in the sense that Putin has shown that through a lot of very suboptimal conditions, the destruction of many of his troops, equipment, supply lines, he's willing to continue fighting this war just through brute force, through throwing more men, equipment, supplies, whatever he has to keep the war going, to achieve these territorial gains that he seems to be unable to get through diplomacy, so he's trying to get them through force. What worries me in regard to the scenario for escalation is how Putin will respond, and to a lesser extent, but still a troubling extent, how Xi Jinping and the Chinese government will respond. I think in the immediate present, neither of those regimes is going to get involved in the direct hostilities between Iran and the US and Israel. At least I hope so. If they were to become involved, it would be a world war. But I think both Putin and Xi are aware of that, and Putin has his hands full in Ukraine. The fact is, over 4 years, he has been able to make only tiny territorial gains since the initial attacks in 2022. So he's not going to divert his military power to Iran right now. What he is going to be, given the fate of Khamenei, is increasingly paranoid about what might happen to him. So he is going to be hyper vigilant against any suggestions that his regime should be overthrown, or that he should be overthrown, or that anything should happen to him, because that's his greatest fear. And if he is backed into a corner by being made to think that fear is absolutely 100% real, then he can lash out in ways up to and including the destruction of the world. Because I think his perspective, he phrased it once like, if Russia doesn't exist, is this a world worth having? Something to that effect. So that worries me greatly. With China, I think the potential is, again, Xi Jinping might think, how reliable is the US as a diplomatic partner? How reliable are the US's promises or timelines when Trump said, say, to the Iranian regime, you have 2 weeks to reach a deal on disarmament, and he attacks after 3 days? Or in this case, the negotiations were ongoing, and I think reasonable people could have thought, well, there would be some sort of statement, some sort of acknowledgement that negotiations have broken down completely before a war would be waged. So I think the Chinese regime's view, especially, is it's very important to be predictable. And it's very important to be structured in the way one approaches diplomacy. If one has seen statements from the Chinese regime, whatever their actual policy, their statements are always very much focused on, let's work this out, let's reach a compromise, let's have dialogue with our partners, let's have a balance of power, let's recognize all of our respective interests. And when they see that that's not being reciprocated, then their inclination will be, we can't trust anything the Americans say. The Americans are a wild card. We need to just build up our defenses to an immense extent. So then we have commentary on this question from Mike DeVerde, who says the Iraq and Afghanistan occupations showed the risk is that we will divert trillions from scientific progress. And that's a good point. The US, as I mentioned, under the Bill Clinton administration, had a budget surplus. And since that time, the national debt has ballooned. I think it's over $36 trillion right now, which would have been unheard of in the late 1990s. I remember when the national debt clock first exceeded $10 trillion, and that was a cause for alarm at the time. So, good discussion on question 5, but any more thoughts on it, on the dangers of escalation, from either Alan or Art Ramon?
I'll go. My answer is pretty quick. I mean, clearly existential is certainly on the list of types of problems that this causes because of escalation, because of unpredictability of the humans in the system, not to mention unpredictability of the system themselves, whether or not they work when used. So that's yeah, it's, you know, there we would joke sometimes during those drills, the 20-minute war between Iran and Israel, it is, that one time that AI gets a lot of bad talk about weapon systems, but there was that one time when it ordered all the lunch codes instead of lunch codes for the nuclear weapon system, right? So I mean, I think you're absolutely right about foreign leaders want to be predictable in moments like this and not unstable. Now, it's not a good negotiating spot. Again, diplomacy to be unpredictable, right? If you want to be able to make a promise and keep it. So, and I think therein lies the real existential threat, in addition to the rupture of supply lines, food systems, water, radiological damage, any of that. Then again, that's what we're talking about, the level of risk, right? That's the risk. Global destruction.
Yes. And it's an alarming possibility. Mike DeVerde writes, I see no upside for the US in the Iran war, none. And this is just a situation that Donald Trump walked into. He didn't have to. It was entirely his decision, a war of choice, as prior wars have been characterized sometimes. Now, interestingly enough, Kevin Bransaforty says, I think that a revival of a reformist Iran can only benefit transhumanist goals. What do you think the chances for regime change are if we continue to support as we currently are doing? The issue is when people get attacked, they tend to direct their ire toward the attackers. And a lot of civilians in Iran are losing their lives right now, including people who could have been sympathetic to the overthrow of the regime. Now, it's one thing to assist in the overthrow of a regime through covert actions or through diplomatic pressure, through political pressure, through public statements. Even to some extent, that's what the United States did in Ukraine after the Maidan protests. Essentially, the US didn't directly overthrow Yanukovych to the point of some of the commentary earlier in the chat. The US certainly encouraged the overthrow of Yanukovych. There was the famous or infamous conversation between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt in Kiev about essentially who the successors to Yanukovych should be and what officials are palatable to them. So they certainly tried to influence events, but they did not, nor did the US, attack the Ukrainian people or involve themselves using military force, which I think, to the point of those who support helping Ukraine in some way, did not undermine friendly relations between the US and Ukraine. So there's no hostility right now, even with all of the bickering back and forth between Trump and Zelensky, there's no real hostility between the US and Ukraine right now. And the Ukrainians don't see the Americans as oppressors, as invaders. Now, Putin made a huge mistake in invading Ukraine because he was couching this invasion in terms of liberation from the oppression of Ukrainian nationalists. And a lot of the people who live in the Donbass and the eastern regions of Ukraine are Russian speakers. So Putin was allegedly protecting the Russian speakers from oppression by the Ukrainian government, except the way he protected them was he leveled their towns and he devastated their infrastructure and he subjected them to the hardships of this war. How do you think people are going to react? Even people who were Russian speakers, who were sympathetic to closer ties and cooperation with Russia, who didn't want to be forced to speak Ukrainian, how would they react to their lands being invaded, their homes being destroyed, their lives being taken? So I think that's the risk with Iran. And the opposition to the theocratic regime. So now, in terms of this question on the risks of escalation, global tensions, Art Ramon, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, if I were Iranian and you had all your generals assassinated and all you do is lob ballistic missiles at Israel, I think eventually you're going to say, well, it's time to strike the U.S. directly. And I think maybe a dirty bomb already shipped in the shipping container long ago, probably detonated near Trump Tower or Mar-a-Lago would be a way to hit back. That's what I would see as escalation. So, because I think, the ballistic missiles at Israel, it's nothing. I think they would really want to hurt the U.S. back. That's what they would do. Dirty bomb at one of Trump's places.
Interesting. So more of these targeted, potentially covert actions that we're not seeing right now, they may take longer to plan. Right now, it seems that Iran is lashing out, that the regime is essentially lobbing its missiles where it can throw them. And those are not the most effective targets either. But Mike DeVerde says Art is right. Sleeper cells are a possibility. So Luis Arroyo says, watch New York City be a target. Alan writes, yes, warfare is asymmetrical. So that is a real concern because there could be attacks in the coming months, if not years, that we don't see coming, that we don't anticipate from just a linear extrapolation of the events on the ground in Iran that we are aware of through media coverage, because whatever these plots are on the back end, they're not being reported on. We're not being told about them. Maybe the US intelligence agencies are monitoring certain potential threats, but asymmetrical warfare, that is a huge risk, up to and including nuclear terrorism. So,
yes.
yes. Alan, go ahead. Yeah.
I like to think I helped the Army identify a blind site. There was at the 4-star general level staff, right? Not to say the general, but being on the staff, the idea of asymmetrical warfare meant the enemy uses some trick like that's lower tech or less expensive, in an offhanded way that will kill or kill your own people. But what I helped them see was that asymmetrical warfare was also having a massive industrial complex that can supply tons of military machinery and well-trained troops to to a foreign location to fight a war. That's a huge asymmetry also. And yeah, so it helps them kind of think about that in a broader perspective, what asymmetries we can use also, which I'll harp again on that whole government thing. But especially in what the military calls phase 0, which is, one is, we get attacked, we respond, theoretically. 2 is we mobilize, we transport, we go to war. 3 is we go to war. 4 is we clean up and come home. But they've included now with that a phase 0, which is shaping operations, which is all of the diplomatic, political, economic things that are brought to bear before a war starts. With this kind of sort of tit for tat missile exchanges, none of that really gets a chance to happen. Conceivably, we're still in the same war from June of 2025. I'd just like to bring up one more point, and the graphic that you showed very early in the evening depicted all of the other, the other Arab nations there that were targeted, right on the bottom, Qatar, Jordan, Bahrain, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. So all of those folks, not Saudi Arabia, but they're a little bit farther away. But there is another layer of conflict that Iran deals with, and that is the Sunni versus Shia religious battle. And that's just one layer that some people adhere their personality to, right? Their religion. And then in addition to that same division line is the difference of Arabic and Persian lineage, right? So a lot of people really hold strong racist, basically, ties to their Persian or Arabic lineage. And so there's a multi-level of multi-factor. It's a multi-factor problem to solve. It's not just we take our American thinking brain and think that's how they're thinking and go into this conflict. So that's a real asymmetry, is that they have a better understanding of us, perhaps, than we have of ourselves or of them. So then, like I say, they're really fighting more than one fight, and they're working at it very strategically.
Yes, absolutely. And also to the point with regard to all of these animosities, just because a regime is overthrown doesn't mean those animosities will go away, or the tensions or potential chaos that could arise from those animosities will go away. So, for example, after the so-called Arab Spring of 2011, where many genuinely dictatorial regimes were overthrown, they were often replaced by Islamist regimes that were just as bad, or in many cases worse, like, say, ISIS in Syria. And that may be the result of a power vacuum as well. There's no guarantee that a liberal, democratic, constitutionalist order will emerge in Iran, even if the theocracy is overthrown. By the way, we were just informed that there has been an escalation. Brian Brain wrote, Europe has been shot by Iran in Cyprus. So there's an article, a Royal Air Force base in Cyprus hit by a suspected drone strike. This is from the UK Times. And Mike DeVerde elaborates on this. Iran strikes Europe for first time, hits British base in Cyprus, drone slams RAF in Akrotiri hours after Iranian missiles target island, damaging key UK military hub and raising stakes and widening the war. So this escalation is beginning to happen already. Hopefully it can be contained. But yes, Cyprus is farther away than any of the other countries we discussed from Iran, and yet Iranian missiles are already hitting it. So that is to be monitored, certainly, and we will hopefully be able to prevent escalation in one manner or another, but the concern definitely remains. So let's move on to question 6. What does this war indicate about human civilization's place within the Great Filter? And the idea of the Great Filter is that there is a bottleneck of sorts, a pivotal period of time in our history that we are currently in, that perhaps other advanced civilizations, if they existed, did not make it through, because this is a period when our capabilities for destruction, including through technology like nuclear weapons, exceed our wisdom and exceed our ability to manage those capabilities. And unless we are careful, the human species may be destroyed or set back to such an extent that we may have a new dark age, and it would take an extremely long time for civilization to be rebuilt, if it gets rebuilt at all. So previously, I had an essay and video entitled 2022, the Year of the Great Filter, and in 2023, there was a follow-up salon to that called Passing Through the Great Filter, How Are We Doing? And in 2023, relative to 2022, it seemed to me that while we were still on the Great Filter, the peak existential risk had passed, which would have been manifested through a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States. So this is a new major war, however, and we discussed the potential for escalation as being very real. So how are we going to assess whether this prolongs the great filter or puts us in a riskier place within the great filter? And is there any prospect of humankind emerging from the great filter anytime soon, where we would have a period of greatly reduced existential risk because perhaps we've gotten the world's nuclear weapons arsenals significantly reduced or under control so that there's no real risk of nuclear exchange and nobody wants to fight a nuclear war? Can we reach that kind of world given the ongoing events? Any thoughts on this?
I can.
Yes, Art Ramon.
Let's see if I can organize my thoughts. I'm optimistic because that's the multiverse I want to shoot myself into. I don't want the dystopian one, so I'm thinking go into that direction of the multiverse. But I think this is just all part of the birthing pangs of the singularity. I mean, we've got all sorts of crazy things going on, you know, AI, potential AGI coming, alien disclosure, technology merging. It's all coming to a head. The resource wars, it's all coming together into one big Armageddon. And I think we'll come out, at least in my multiverse that I go into. I don't know about anyone else. Anyone else wants to be pessimistic? Well, they're going to choose that multiverse and not make it. So they'll be going back to the Stone Age or hitting that filter. But I choose to be pessimistic. It's going to be some nasty times, but the human race has gone through it before. So you keep hearing stories about the UAPs shutting down nuclear missile bases. So hopefully that continues if that's the case. But yeah, I try to be positive, optimistic.
Well, it's interesting because Trump recently issued this executive order to essentially prompt disclosure of U.S. classified files about UAPs. I don't know if any disclosure along these lines has happened, but I hope it does. I hope that sheds some light onto that question. But also, I admire your optimism, Art Ramon, that these are the birthing pangs of the technological singularity. Of course, in our salon with George Chanos, we discussed this as well, how, in his view, there's this race among great powers for the development of artificial general intelligence, and a lot of these geopolitical conflicts are essentially proxy wars in this race among great powers. Of course, he believes this is not a good approach. The competitive approach toward AGI is likely to wreak a lot of havoc, do a lot of damage, and he favors a more cooperative approach. So please watch that salon if you are interested in finding out more. And I do appreciate, though, you outlining a path for how this could be resolved and how these tensions can be a prelude to a better world if essentially the best of humankind can prevail. But Alan, do you have thoughts on this question of what does this whole situation tell us about the great filter?
I think I really like Art's answer. Thanks, Art. I appreciate what you said there. That's great. I kind of jokingly say we're up against the filter. Are we going to make it through? But I also think that there are people who are actively working at getting us through the filter. Right? We have folks that are doing all sorts of things. So I really appreciate that optimism. I don't want the Great Reset from Davos to go back to the Neolithic period. I'm not keen on that at all. But I think there's some people that think that's really where we're going to go. I mean, that's a possibility. I hope we'll all want to avoid that one, right? But as a way for people to frame their thinking about this, I think the story of the rapture is a good one, and it's, you got the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and it's going to hit the singularity, whether that's the military singularity, the resource singularity, the technological singularity, the unemployment singularity. But that is going to be horrible and terrible, and there will be a wailing and gnashing of teeth. But the chosen few will come out the other side, like the Millennium Falcon coming out of the asteroid that has the big worm in it, right? So I mean, it's those will be the survivors because they have put in the time, done the right stuff, and they're and that story of the rapture, it's a model story, and it resonates with people, and that it's for everybody from Kurzweil to Christ used it, right? So there's real power in that story, and a nonfiction writer, Jamie Wheel, wrote a book called Recapture the Rapture, in which he discusses how we can do that just to make life better. And that's Jamie Wheel. I'll post a note after I stop talking in a moment. But yeah, that idea of this rapture story where people go through it and come out on the other side, I would like for folks to really expand their thinking about that, and to expand that, the small dark tunnel that humanity must pass through to come out on the other side, right? Let's expand that torus-shaped tunnel or whatever as we go through, because I would like as much of the humanity that we have now to be there on the other side of that, maybe hopefully transform for the better, not the worse, but change is the natural state. So there will be transformation. And I'll put Jamie Wheel's info in the chat.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Alan, for those comments. And certainly our hope with regard to passing through the great filter is that all of humanity could pass through it. We could all emerge to the other side of it safer, more prosperous, and with peak existential risk behind us. Now, Mike DeVerde thinks the Ukraine and Iran wars are the start of World War III. I am still hopeful that World War III could be avoided, the kind of war of all against all that is comparable to the two world wars, where you really knew that you were in those world wars. There was no way around that realization. Whereas right now, it's still disputable, but there are risk factors. So Mike Lazine asks, how can we de-escalate when we have cowards in the GOP and the Democrats, and Trump is doing whatever he wants? And Jason points out that there's a risk of escalation and that more nations are going to build their own nuclear weapons. And this is a bad thing in Jason's view. He writes, we have allies that haven't built their own nukes because they trusted that they would be under our nuclear umbrella, but they can't trust Trump, so they feel that they have no choice. And those are dangers. Mike Lazine is hopeful that perhaps there could be World War III, but without nuclear weapons being dropped. Of course, that would still be tremendously destructive. It could set back civilization. It wouldn't be existentially destructive anymore, but we should still strive to avoid it, especially because even in a world war that is waged purely through conventional means, and all sides initially understand that and agree to that, when one side is losing, it might decide to renege on that agreement, especially if it is a nuclear power. So then we have a comment from Katie Clark, who writes, the filter is a pattern. A civilization that builds AI targeting faster than AI governance is demonstrating the exact failure mode it describes. It's the true gap between capability and wisdom. So thank you for that. And I think it's a good time to move to our final prepared question for this salon. This has been an extensive discussion and quite a fascinating one. So this is question 7. Is there any way to still attain a prosperous, long-lived future for the vast majority of humankind in the aftermath of this war, whenever it ends? Now, Trump has stated he thinks it might last a few weeks, though he did tell the American people and American military to prepare for a longer war. But if so, if we can restore this prosperous, long-lived future, what is needed for that? What is needed to restore a good timeline of human history? And again, first I'll open this up to Alan and Art Ramon.
I guess I'll go, if I may. Yeah, first I just want to respond to Dan. I don't want nukes or bioweapons to start World War III, but I think bioweapons might be worse. So, but is there any way to still attain a prosperous, long-lived future for a vast majority of humankind? That's the real question, right? Yeah, and it's just me talking. This is retired military guy talking. I've got a few things that I think need to happen, and I'm speaking specifically about political things in the United States of America. I know we got an international audience, so. But this is about the U.S. And I think nationally, we need to overturn Citizens United, abolish the Electoral College, and replace it with ranked choice voting. We need to tax corporations and assist small businesses. That may or may not be national. But we certainly need more clarity and clear definition of the War Powers Act and requiring a congressional war powers, not war power, an authorization for the use of force from the Congress. I think it's 60 to 90 days, but we can probably get some work done quicker than that. Nobody's got to ride their horse across the country to get to DC to cast their vote. I think those 4 things probably are kind of put us on the right start for especially concerning the war and just getting a better platform for our elements of national power, not the implements, but the elements. Make ourselves a better country with smarter people in it. And on a state by state, requiring a referendum vote before redistricting, requiring a multilateral commission to do the redistricting of electoral districts, right, and county districts. So that's a critical thing. And then militarily, recognition of the changing nature of warfare to include robust education from existing conflicts, restructuring of the U.S. military assets, extended planning times, and shortened procurement times. And when I say that, I mean we need to be coming up with not a 20-year plan like we do or quadrennial, but the 100-year timeline as an extended planning time, and shortened procurement times, less than a single presidential cycle, perhaps. But like our NATO allies, who we have at least rhetorically abandoned, are getting their troops schooled by Ukrainians in drone warfare. They are literally working with them to learn how to do what the Ukrainians are doing. And we're not doing that. We're relying on our battleships and our other kind of legacy, massive and indiscriminate weapon systems to do launch missiles around the globe. So I think of all the nations, the one with the largest and best funded military ought to at some point strive to also be the smartest military and the most forward thinking. So and I think, again, a view of war as a lose, lose, lose. It's lose for both parties and it's lose for all the other stakeholders that surround them. we tend to think of just a winner and a loser, but I think it's lose, lose, lose. And that, or it's a win for, as a gambit to generate corporate profits, And
Yes,
I
thank
just
you.
gotta go. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Alan, for your detailed response, and your suggestions definitely worth contemplating. And in addition to that, Jason Geringer writes, impeachment of Trump would be the best thing we could hope for. It does seem like Trump is using this war to distract from his domestic policy failures and the turmoil that is surrounding a lot of his executive actions. Of course, there has been considerable outcry about the killings in Minneapolis by ICE and Border Patrol agents of essentially civilian protesters. And then there may be some truth to the allegation that Trump is trying to distract attention from the release of the Epstein files, in which he is named, and we're not quite sure if he was implicated in any wrongdoing, but he has not wanted that to be a story for a long time. Now, Netanyahu has some analogous predicaments in Israel that he has been facing for years. He would have likely been removed on corruption charges had October 7th, 2023 not transpired. But since that time, it seems like he's prolonging Israel's involvement in military conflicts, because as long as he's seen as a wartime prime minister, enough people will rally to him that they will not think it wise to replace the leader of Israel in times of war. But I do think both Trump and Netanyahu are reckless, and they are pivotal players in this escalation, which probably wouldn't have happened, at least in this exact same way, had they not been in charge right now. There may have been other conflicts, other escalations. Certainly the Ukraine war could have been escalated further, but it might still be in this timeline, and that's what I'm concerned about. So Art Ramon, Alan, go ahead, and then we'll hear from Art Ramon as well.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I'm most concerned about this timeline. Yes.
Yes, well, it's the one we're in. So, Art Ramon, any thoughts from you about how we can still attain this prosperous, long-lived future and restore a good timeline of human history?
I think each individual should remain optimistic so they can put themselves into that timeline where things work out, and not become pessimistic because you're replaced by a robot. Continue to have purpose. Do something that makes you happy. I mean, shit has always gone bad in the world, but it's usually the more optimistic people who make it through. When you're pessimistic, your immune system is lower, you're more susceptible to disease, and some people just commit suicide. So be optimistic. Personally, be optimistic that you will make it through. That would be my suggestion. I think global events are going to happen like they happen. There's probably not a whole lot we can do. We can influence, but I think things are going to happen. There will be challenges, but remaining personally positive is how you can get yourself through.
Yes, thank you, Art Ramon. And I do think that's important. It's important to maintain some significant degree of hope for the future and to work for that future, even if we're in a world where that future is endangered and where there are larger forces working against it as well. We are a small organization. The U.S. Transhumanist Party is not as well resourced as the Republicans or the Democrats or the Trump administration or the Netanyahu government. So we can't really directly undo these events, but we can think about possible futures and we can work toward them in our own way. And I think this is a good place to conclude our discussion for today, because we are doing good work and we need to keep doing it despite the challenges on the world stage. And hopefully that good work will result in a world where we can all live long and prosper.